And Dr. Llewellyn Jones's talk is the second in the Commonwealth Heritage Forum series on cemeteries and burial grounds across the Commonwealth. And today she will be discussing her work with the British Association for Cemeteries in South Asia, or BACSA, which is a charity that was set up nearly 50 years ago. So over 1,000 old British cemeteries line the Indian subcontinent, which are reminders of our shared colonial history there. Some, like the Calcutta cemeteries, are extremely grand, while others are more simple sites where graves have since lost their inscriptions. And from the first European traders at Surat to victims of the Great Uprising of 1857, BACSA does what it can to record all of those buried far from home. Repairs and restorations, where feasible, are carried out with the help of local people. And this talk will look at BACSA's work in a challenging and changing environment. Dr. Llewellyn Jones is a colonial historian who has written extensively about the subcontinent. She's also been the editor of the Calcutta Charities Journal since its inception in 1977. And with that, I'll now hand off to Dr. Rosa Llewellyn Jones. And thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Ashley. So, two monsoons, two reasons for this title. Let's start with the first one. It was reckoned during the 18th century that two monsoons, that is 2 seasons, 2 years, was the average life of a European in India. Very, very short. And there are good reasons to back this up too, because we have burial registers from the mid-18th century onwards. And life expectancy was incredibly short. In 1818, for example, average life expectancy, not counting young children, was 30 years. The following year, 1819, it had gone up by 1 year. So you might survive until you were 31, but not a very good chance of it. So two monsoons seems a suitable way of encapsulating the early deaths and hence the number of huge burials in South Asia. And Two Monsoons was also the title of the book that really started BACSA in 1976. Next slide, please. And BACSA was set up by Thean Wilkinson, MBE. BACSA stands for the British Association for Cemeteries in South Asia. And although a lot of our work is concentrated in India, it's by no means exclusively so. In fact, we try to deal with everywhere where the East India Company set foot. And that is a huge area from the treaty ports in China right through to stations like Aden, which was a useful stop-off for ships, and even Bahrain, which for a short time actually had a British resident who was part of the East India Company. So we've got a very wide remit. Now, Thean Wilkinson, whom I knew, started in India. He thought he would just look at the Indian cemeteries, and there are a huge number of old European, mainly British cemeteries in India. There are almost 850 recorded, and these are only the ones that we know about. There are also quite a number of isolated graves. So it seemed sensible that Thean would actually start in India, and the whole thing began when he took his son for a 21st birthday present to India. And the reason was that Thean himself had been born in Kanpur, which is now Kanpur, in the 1920s. And by coincidence, his wife had also been born there too, again in the 1920s. They met in England, but obviously they had mutual interests, both coming from families which had long connections with India. So it made sense that Thean started to go out, look at cemeteries in India, and in particular work in the archives of the British High Commission in Delhi, which had accumulated most of the material from the cemetery committees after 1947, when India became independent. Next, please. And the fruit of all this research, which took a good year, most of it in India, was Two Monsoons, the book published by Thean in 1976. And this was quite an eye-opener for a large number of people who had no idea of the extent of the burials in India in particular. Now, Thean had retired. He'd actually been an army officer in the Gurkha regiments. And then he came back and went into personnel management in England, but that didn't satisfy him. He was haunted by the thought of all these European cemeteries, many in very, very poor conditions indeed. And he felt that if he didn't do something, they would be lost within a very short time. So it wasn't just the book, it was Thean's impetus that set up the British Association for Cemeteries in South Asia. And that started the following year. What he did was quite clever, actually. He contacted regiments, museums, churches, all kinds of people who might have a tenuous connection with India, and brought them all together. And the first meeting was actually at the National Army Museum, which was quite appropriate given that there was a strong regimental interest. And it soon attracted, more or less by word of mouth, all kinds of people. I didn't actually join until 1977. And again, it was because somebody had told me about it. I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I'm an Indian historian and I like cemeteries. So it seemed to make perfect sense. So this was the book, and this was the man that led to the formation of BAXA. It was a one-man operation. Next, please. And I think we couldn't really understand that enthusiasm, if you like, for preserving Britain's heritage in India and South Asia if we didn't have this romanticized picture, certainly of India. And although this is just a fantasy picture, it's just made up, but I think it does capture something of the excitement of how our ancestors lived in India, of what they did, of what they created. And there's a kind of magnificence, certainly, about India, which remains today, which is why it still attracts so many people, so many tourists from the West, America, Australia as well. So while we're dealing with practicalities, let us not lose sight of the romantic aspect to India. Perhaps I'm just a romantic, but this is what spurs me on. I've been involved with BAXA since 1977, a very long time, and I'm still enthusiastic about it, which is why I'm talking about it to you today. Next, please. So let's have a look at some of the things BAXA does. You might think it's only genealogy that is going to interest people with graves in South Asia and India. And it's a very important part of what we do. We're asked frequently if we can help trace the grave of an ancestor in India, less commonly in Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Burma, which are our main areas, but certainly in India, we get frequent inquiries. People trying to trace their ancestors for perhaps a family history. So we're looking at the 18th century, but often it's more personal than that. We have had people who were born in India just before independence, born in the 1940s, and perhaps they had lost an older brother, a little sibling, a baby who had been born before them and was buried somewhere in India. And after generations almost, they wanted to try and find that grave. We've certainly had several occasions like that where we've been able to find a baby sibling, an infant sibling of somebody who died, for BAXA members. And then there's, of course, the excitement of finding someone who didn't really know much about, somebody who was buried in India. And it's not only genealogy, historians and researchers can go out looking for graves of people they're writing about. That happens less frequently, but we certainly have one BAXA member whose great-great-great-grandmother was killed during the Mutiny Uprising in Cawnpore, and he has not only been out to see the memorial to her, but has also interested other people whose relatives were also killed at the same time. So genealogy can take many forms. It's not just where your grandfather or your grandmother is buried. But as I say, it's an important part, and it's something Baxter takes great pleasure in if we can actually find a grave that somebody is looking for. You don't have to be a Baxter member to ask us questions about your ancestors. We will welcome everyone and we'll try to help everyone. Now, an important part of our job is recording the names of those buried in all these cemeteries, nearly 1,000 in India, burials Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, Malaya, Malaysia. And this is a huge task. We're very lucky that the British Library at St Pancras in London has offered us space to keep our archives. And although space is limited, obviously, we do have all our cemetery files there. Every cemetery we know about has a file in the British Library. Sometimes it's a fat file, it's full of photographs, it's full of descriptions of recent visits. Sometimes it's just one piece of paper where we only know the name of the cemetery and when it was closed. But recording is important, and we're gradually adding to the names on our website. It's never going to be possible to know the names of every Briton or European buried in India. That would be ridiculous. We estimate there may be as many as 1 million, perhaps 1.5 million Europeans, mainly Britons, buried in the subcontinent. But at least we're having a go. And if you go to our website now, you can look at the list of cemeteries. You can't at the moment find individual names, though I will talk about that later on. So recording is very important. And sometimes it's just a question of somebody going around with a camera or a mobile phone and just photographing headstones, some of which are almost illegible, and writing down what they can. So recording takes many forms. It's not just physically on the ground. It can also be going through old books, old documents. A series of books were published in the beginning of the last century called Monumental Inscriptions. And these are very useful because obviously inscriptions vanish. We're looking at 75 years since independence. So recording takes many forms, rather like genealogy. Now, restoration, it's not always possible, of course, to restore things to how they were, and we wouldn't want it to be either. India's moved on, Britain has moved on, but it is useful, particularly when we get queries from local people in India, for example, saying, there's an old cemetery, the wall has fallen down, can you do anything to help? And yes, we can. We will only work through local people. Nobody from Britain goes out to tell workmen what to do. That's not how it works. But if local people are interested, and particularly if they can raise some money from their side, then we are generous with grants. We pay out quite a lot of money every year, and we will help them. We certainly will, and we'll look at some examples of restoration later on. Now, conservation is obviously different from restoration. Restoration, in a way, means building something which had gone. That's why I mentioned walls, but conservation can be looking after individual tombstones, if you like, making sure that they're kept in good order, because a lot of, certainly the 18th century graves that we're looking at in cemeteries were made out of brick and covered with stucco. Now, stucco deteriorates quite quickly and it really needs to be checked every year. Another really quite damaging thing are little bushes, and the seeds will lodge themselves between the stones where the stucco moves away. And obviously you get something which is turning into a bush, and the roots are going down and they're actually splitting aside the bricks. So conservation would certainly mean removing little bushes, even small seedlings, before they can get a grip. cleaning tombstones, that's quite important too, but not harshly scrubbing them away. The conservation again can take many forms. So though it may look simple, genealogy, recording, restoration, conservation, there are strands to all these elements, and we try to cover them all. Next slide. I talked about the joy of people finding relatives, and this is Mr. Lee from Australia, who a few years ago found his great-grandfather's grave at Shimoga, which is a very, very small part. I think it's in Madhya Pradesh. I'm a bit vague on South Indian geography, but look at what happened. Everybody has come out. The local priest is there, and I think it's quite obvious that the ground has been cleared fairly recently here. I'm sure that when Mr. Lee made his original inquiry, in fact, I think I remember him saying it was just a mass of grass and bushes and all kinds of things. But as soon as he showed an interest, then the local people started to clean up the area, and you can see it's absolutely spotless. The tomb sort of stands out like that, has a cross on it. And anybody coming out to South Asia and looking for the grave of an ancestor or someone they're interested in, it does give a tremendous impetus to the local people. It really does. And you can see how happy people are and how happy Mr. Lee is too. Obviously, people don't expect cemeteries to be cleared of grass for nothing. So there's often a fairly generous donation attached to it. But people are very pleased. It's not just the people who find the graves, it's the people in whose area the graves are too. In this case, the priest was particularly helpful and particularly pleased to have found it. Next, please. Now, this is a slightly better known cemetery, South Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta, absolutely magnificent. It's probably the most magnificent cemetery in the whole of South Asia. And if you know Père Lachaise in Paris, well, South Park Street really is so much better. It's so much more impressive. And it's also one of the first planned cemeteries not attached to a church. There are paths there, and it's quite regular. Now, this was interesting. The woman standing up is Lady Emma Monson, and she is here because her husband's ancestor, George Monson, died in the 1780s in Calcutta. He was quite a prominent figure. He was a council member, and his wife died just 6 months after him. And for some reason, Lady Anne Monson had never had an inscription. We knew where her tomb was because it was next to that of her husband, but there was no inscription. And the family assumed it was probably because there's no one left or available to put up an inscription. So Emma Monson, a few years ago, decided that she would have an inscription made, which she did with the help of a local craftsman, and would go out to Calcutta and dedicate it. And it was a lovely occasion. So it's not just the past that haunts us, it can be the present day too. There was a huge ceremony that she wasn't quite expecting. She had to give a speech. The Bishop of Calcutta was there, hymns were sung and all kinds of things, and a wreath placed there. So now if you go to South Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta, you will see not only George Monson's tomb, but that of his wife Anne next to him with an inscription. And you can see how personal it is. Sometimes we're not just talking cemeteries, tombstones, we're talking family connections. Next, please. I mentioned that we also cover what is now Malaysia. And people tend to forget that there was a sizable European, mainly British community in what was then Malaya. A lot of them were rubber planters. And in this case, talking about a little child who died and been buried there, we were able to locate the cemetery where Keith had been buried. And also because we had a local area representative there, he got the whole of the cemetery area cleaned, and the curbstone of the grave was reinstated. We work, as I said, through local people, and we have a number of what we call area representatives who can be based here in Britain, but are often based in parts of South Asia, perhaps a Briton who's settled there, and they know their area well, and they know the local people, and they know how to get tombs like this restored. So that was very important. Some money did change hands, but it is still cheaper at the moment to restore tombs and cemeteries in South Asia than it is here, though costs are actually going up. Next, please. And going back to the talk some of you may have seen last week, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I didn't see the talk, unfortunately, but I think they made clear that the Commonwealth War Grave Commission only deal with the graves of those who died or killed during the two world wars. So that's 1914 to 1920, 1939 to I think 1948. There's a few years afterwards, because obviously you can be wounded during a conflict and die afterwards. So if you had the bad luck to be killed as a soldier during the 1930s, for example, no one is going to look after your grave unless Baxter does. And we go right back to the earliest incursions by Europeans, by Britons in South Asia. And this is Ramnagar in Pakistan, which commemorates a battle during the Anglo-Sikh War. Obviously, the Punjab at that time covered what is now both Pakistan and northern India. And this is interesting because this was initiated by a local retired army officer who came to Baxter and said, here's a war memorial that's actually falling down. Do you deal with war memorials? And we said, of course, yes, of course we do. So work is continuing here, and they've actually done some quite good work. It's often useful to have a retired army officer because, first of all, they're still looking for something to do, and they have local contacts, and they have a certain, I wouldn't like to say power, but a certain reputation. So we were very happy to work with our army officer in Ramnagar. We don't actually have much going on in Pakistan at the moment for political reasons. It's not that easy for Christians, and we have to be careful and we have to be sensitive to a Christian cemetery in a Muslim country. Obviously, it would be daft not to take this into account. So although we don't have a lot going on there, we do what we can, and we will always respond to queries from, as I say, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, India, anywhere in South Asia, anywhere where the East India Company were. Next, please. Now, it's not just abroad that you find people with Indian connections, and this is an interesting one. This was picked up by a Baxter member who's the bookseller. He was interested in the career of Colonel Montgomery, who was a surveyor in the mid-19th century in India. And he says that although he'd walked past this cemetery fairly near his house many, many times, it was only recently he realized that one of his heroes, Colonel Montgomery, was actually buried here. We do have a section in Baxter on our website called Monumental Inscriptions. And this is a list of people with South Asian, mainly Indian connections who are buried in Britain. And we actually have a fairly extensive list. And you can see why, because Cheltenham and Bath, for example, were spa towns. And people coming back, particularly from India, they'd often drunk too much, their livers were affected, they thought spa waters would help. So if you wander around churches in Cheltenham, as I do, because that's where I come from, a huge number of plaques and memorials are to people with Indian connections, and we always welcome these. As I said, we have quite an extensive list now of monumental inscriptions, people with South Asian, Indian connections buried here in Britain. So that's another little angle that we deal with. Next, please. Going back to Pakistan, I put this in because it's a cemetery I visited a few years ago when I was lecturing in Pakistan at Dharampura. And this is one of several cemeteries in Lahore. And I put in these two pictures, this and the next one, because I wanted to show you how things deteriorate. If we could have the next image, please. And this is what it looked like when I was there a couple of years ago. It's mainly gone. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And you can see why, and you can see what I said about the stucco, that sort of white peeling covering over the bricks. And these small bricks are usually called Lakori bricks because you need almost a lack of them to build anything at all. You can see how the arches are formed, and you can see how the stucco was holding it all together. And you can also see, if you look at those slots along the top, this is actually where the roof timbers went. The timbers have gone completely. They've just left the mark on the wall where they were. And the inscription has more or less gone too. This is how things deteriorate. And obviously it's not always possible to restore them. All we can do is to record them, which is why photographs from the 1930s, for example, are so useful. We can see what a place used to look like before it was left to rack and ruin. Next, please. Now, I put this in, even though the inscription is in Hindi and my Hindi isn't that good, because it's a very good example of somebody from India, Dr. Sharma, who takes a great interest in Indian history and actually got this tomb preserved. Now, Captain Bolton was at Mathura during the uprising of 1857, and he was trying to drive the treasure chests from the treasury to safety. And you can imagine these sort of enormous chests on the back of a buffalo cart, and the buffalo is not moving very quickly. And Captain Bolton was shot. He was actually shot in this area. The treasure was seized by those opposing the East India Company, and they made off with it. After it was all over, the British put up a tomb around Captain Bolton. His burial place had been marked. Now, Dr. Sharma was quite outraged a few years ago when there was a proposal to demolish this tomb because they wanted to extend a road. So he contacted Baxter, and we wrote about it and contacted various learned authorities. So I wanted to illustrate that it's India's history too. It's not our history. It's not colonial history. It's the history that belongs to the people in India and South Asia. And many of them take an acute interest in it. I'm not saying everyone does, obviously. If they did, then the cemeteries wouldn't be in the state many of them are in. But there are enough people now, certainly in India, who are happy to help preserve their own history, our shared history. Let's face it, I mean, we share our history, as simple as that. Next, please. And this is an extreme example of Indians sharing British history. Some of you will certainly know about Hodson, and he was a fairly infamous person. He was the man, a soldier, an officer, who actually shot the sons of the last Mughal emperor in Delhi. You can imagine the situation at the time. He claimed he felt threatened. This probably wasn't the case. So he continued, and he was actually in Lucknow when the city of Lucknow in northern India was recaptured in 1858, in March 1858. A tremendous lot of looting went on, a tremendous amount of fighting, and Hodson was actually shot dead by, what would we call them, a rebel sepoy. It's thought that he was a marked man ever since he murdered the sons of the last Mughal emperor. He was, in fact, a marked man. And it said there was a price on his head, which was probably why he was shot. So at the time, he was taken to one of the country houses where he died. And he's buried in the grounds of a college called La Martiniere College in Lucknow, a well-known college. And his tomb has been refurbished. It's actually very splendid. But the thing that amazes me is that every year on the anniversary of his death, soldiers from Hodson Horse, which was the regiment he founded, come and perform a ceremony at the tomb. And when you consider what Hodson actually did, this still surprises me. But nevertheless, it's an example of Indians perhaps reinterpreting our shared history. So Hodson's tomb is there. And this is one that Baxter doesn't need to look after. We really don't. Though we were instrumental a few years ago in getting a donation channeled from the Hodson's Horse Association in Britain to the restoration, but now it's been taken over by the college and by the Hodson's Horse people. So we don't need to worry about it, not at the moment anyway. Next, please. And Nicholson is another person who was actually killed during the uprising of 1858. His tomb is probably one of the earliest ones in this particular cemetery. It's called Nicholson Cemetery now after him because he was the most prominent person to have been buried there. It's in Old Delhi, for those of you who know the city. It's by the Kashmir Gate. It's just opposite, actually, the Kashmir Gate. And as I say, it was one of the first tombs there when the cemetery was in pretty good condition. Unfortunately, it's a huge cemetery and it really has deteriorated. Not the tombs themselves, which were fairly solidly built, but the grass and the jungle, as people call it, have grown up. So Baxter was able to restore the gateways to the cemetery here. If we have the next slide. And you can see on the right-hand side that it's all been refurbished and painted. And it's often quite important. I mean, you may say that a sort of simple gatehouse like this is not important. And it isn't. I mean, architecturally, it's not important. It's just a sort of arch. But I think psychologically, it's important that cemeteries do look as though they're cared for, not only to have the cross there, but to look fairly neat and tidy, and also to try and get rid of rubbish and encroachments outside. It's often one of Baxter's aims when faced with a restoration to say, well, what is your gatehouse like? What are your walls like? And if we can make sure they're fairly secure, then we can start work on the tombs inside. And you can imagine, obviously, if a wall is broken down, then you're going to get people coming in, you get people taking drugs, people drinking. You also get animals coming in. And some of the larger animals, like buffaloes, can actually rub themselves, scratching an itch against tombstones, knock the whole thing over. So security is important. There's no doubt about this. And this is a very good example of how a large cemetery can be made to look secure, but also at the same time welcoming. So this is an important part of Baxter's work, not just what's inside the cemetery, but the surroundings too. Next, please. And talking about, I suppose, the eclectic mix of people buried in the cemeteries, I've hastened to say that European cemeteries too, and there are a few cemeteries set up by Europeans, because as you know, Britain wasn't by any means the only country to be in India. We have the Dutch, the Swiss, the French, the Danes, and this particular cemetery is also known as the Garrison Cemetery at Seringapatam in southern India. But de Meuron, the Comte de Meuron, was a French soldier who went out and formed a little regiment. He was actually working for one of the South Indian princes. But this is what's called the de Meuron Cemetery. But also it's interesting because buried here is a little Indian girl who was probably the mistress or wife of a Swiss officer. And we thought that was rather nice. She herself was probably a Hindu, possibly a Muslim, but nevertheless is buried in a Christian cemetery. And we do get examples of this. We're not by any means just looking at Britons buried in British cemeteries. We are eclectic. Next, please. And I put this in because it's quite a good example of something you might not immediately recognize as a cemetery. In fact, it's over the river from the main city of Calcutta in Howrah. And again, those of you who know the city will think of the railway station. But in fact, this is part of what used to be the botanical garden in Calcutta. The garden itself has shrunk considerably. And part of it was given to Bishop's College in about 1850. Obviously, a college, a Christian college. And some of the teachers and also some of the students within the college were buried in the grounds. So although it doesn't look very exciting at first, this is a recognized cemetery, and we do actually have records of who was buried there. Next, please. And talking about the importance of recording and searching for burials and records, this was just a sheet of paper that somebody sent me, but I was able to find some interesting names among them of people actually buried in that little cemetery, including a man who was working in the botanical garden that was actually killed by an escaped tiger. So he is here too. These records can tell us a lot and poignant stories. Next, please. Now, one thing Baxter does pretty well is to guide people to cemeteries, and they're often pretty difficult to find. I mean, obviously, many of them are neglected, the walls are broken down. And if you go unprepared, you're going to have a very frustrating time trying to find a particular cemetery. I mean, the magic words are Gora Kabristan, the white people's graveyard, and sometimes that'll work and other times it won't. Often if you go with the name of a cemetery, St. John's Cemetery, for example, it won't be recognized. So you actually need a map and you need a good guide. So one thing Baxter has done is to provide site maps of cemeteries, not the actual plan of the cemetery once you get inside, but how to get to the cemetery. And we've got a very good collection. So if people are planning to visit a cemetery and they're not quite sure about it, it's worth checking our archives and checking with us, because we may be able to produce something as good as this. Next, please. I talked about Bangladesh, and I have to say that Baxter's record isn't one of, success. We do have failures. We absolutely do have failures. We have many successes, but I don't want to show that it's, picture everything we do is marvelous, because it isn't. And this is a particularly good example. Now, this is the Narinda tomb in southern Dhaka. I went down to see it a few years ago. I'm actually standing there to give some perspective and idea of the height. It's an extraordinary tomb. It was actually painted by Johann Zoffany, the artist, when he was in what was then undivided India. We spent many years trying to establish who might be buried here without very much success. It has resemblances to the early Dutch tombs in Surat in Western India. We cannot find who is buried here, but we recognize that it's a tomb of outstanding importance. And for years, we've been trying to get it restored. Architects have drawn up plans of restoration. There have always been problems. Sometimes it is the local bishop, sometimes it's the municipality, sometimes it's in a conservation area, and sometimes it isn't. It's a great shame. It's not going to be there forever, which is why we've photographed it every time we go out. So at the moment, we would love to restore it. We have the funds to do so. We have people on the ground, but it just isn't happening at the moment. It is very frustrating. So it's not just physical decay. It's bureaucracy and vested interests and that kind of thing. Next, please. And this is another sad example too. This is at Chunar, which is in northern India. And one of the reasons why we're so interested in Chunar was that it was one of the places that had very, very good sandstone, exceptionally good sandstone, so good that it was exported throughout India, often for other tombstones too. So you find Chunar sandstone down in southern India. And as you can see, the finely carved, but unfortunately, again, bureaucracy is in the way of Baxter doing anything, or even local people doing anything. It's really sad. You can see the goats have made themselves at home there, and so have the local cricketers. You can see one chap with a bat, and he's probably using some of the tombstones as a wicket. Well, fair enough, but we would love to get our hands on this. And interesting enough, we know most of the people who were buried here. We have inscriptions. We could restore it if we were given the chance. Next, please. And I put this in because it's such a glorious picture of what actually happens if nobody does anything at all. This church covered in banyan leaves and branches and roots. It's a poignant example of what happens and what can happen. Next, please. And the Cawnpore Angel, I mentioned one of the Baxter members whose ancestors were killed at Cawnpore. We also take an interest in things like this. This is a memorial that was put up to mark the site of the infamous well, where a number of women and children were massacred and their bodies thrown down. It's now been moved, but although Baxter wouldn't actually get involved in restoring something like this, if it needed restoring, we mark it. And we did publish a book on statues of the Raj some 2 decades ago. So we know more or less where all of the British erected statues are or were. A few of them have been repatriated back to Britain. But I'm happy to say that Indians seem quite happy with statues. They may not always be where they were originally erected. Some have been taken to Barrackpore, others are in museums, but by and large, they're all there. And the angel is still there too. And it is perhaps a sign of Indian tolerance that the angel, marking a significant event in the mutiny, is still there and undamaged. Next, please. And I'm going on now to talking about practical things that Baxter does. I said that we dealt with conservation and restoration, and this is actually dealing with both of the subjects. It's a manual that was written by a conservation architect who's a member of Baxter, Dr. Neetha Das. And Neetha has much practical experience in dealing with restoration. She's been working in the Scottish Cemetery in Calcutta for many years. And together I suggested to Neetha, whom I know, that we should actually do a manual, a kind of guide for people who want to restore cemeteries, often without Baxter's help. You don't always need us if you've got the willingness and people on the ground to do it. So we published it it's a practical handbook, as you can see, for the care of old tombs and cemeteries in South Asia. We published it in English, in Bengali, in Hindi and Urdu, and it can be downloaded from our website for free. It is important that people have the information in order to restore tombs. If they're willing to, they can find out how to do it. And the English version is illustrated with practical line drawings, so you can see exactly what to do. Next, please. And here is work in progress. This is actually in the Scottish Cemetery. The cemetery has received considerably large grants, both from Baxter, but also from its parent company, the Kolkata Scotland Heritage Trust. which was set up about 15 years ago, specifically at the time, to restore this one cemetery, which has a lot of graves of Scottish people who died in northern India, mainly Calcutta. So here we are, bamboo scaffolding, because if you're not wearing shoes, as many of the workmen aren't, it's easier to get a grip with your feet on bamboo. And ecologically, it's probably better to have bamboo than importing iron scaffolding. And what's happened here is that the particular tomb has been stripped of its stucco because the stucco has sort of fallen off. It's being stabilized, and then it's going to have stucco over it again. So this is really work in action. And Nita Das, the conservation architect who wrote the Baxter manual, is there on the right-hand side without shoes. Next, please. And here's another example of work in progress. This is the residency cemetery in Hyderabad in South India. And this was instigated by the Deccan Heritage Group. And I should say that Baxter is often happy to work with other groups like the Kolkata Scotland Heritage Trust in Calcutta, the Deccan Heritage Group here in Hyderabad. We also work with INTAC, which is the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. So, you know, we will latch on to people like this. Anyone who's interested in restoring cemeteries, we're happy to help. We're happy to join them. And this is a particularly fine example. Here they are actually using iron scaffolding, metal scaffolding, but it's going to be good when it's finished. It really is. And again, Baxter's putting quite substantial amounts of money into the restoration of this really nice little cemetery, which is well walled, well protected. And it's now on the tourist map, which is important because the residency, which actually fronts the cemetery, became a college. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the college, but it's now been restored. It's an absolutely marvelous building. It is the residency that William Dalrymple has written about in White Moguls, because it's where Achilles Kirkpatrick met and wooed his lovely Indian bride. So it's a very significant site and a very significant cemetery too. Baxter, very happy to be involved in this. Next, please. And here is, again, more practical work. We're back in the Scottish cemetery in Kolkata. And this chap is doing something with the dowels. Because when you have iron dowels, obviously they rust. And as soon as the rain gets in through the stucco, you've got a problem. It's splitting the stone. So what they're doing are putting in new dowels, and he's working away carefully. So, you know, very, very detailed, some of this work. It's not all building walls and stuff. It's very fine work. And in fact, we're lucky that we have very fine workmen too, particularly in India, who can do this kind of fine work. Next, please. And we're getting near the end, the tiger's tomb. We come across, I know it sounds a bit frivolous, but we come across a number of animal graves in India. We've only found them in India so far. Graves of horses and graves of dogs, usually. Now, this particular story, we don't know whether it's true or not, but a hunter out hunting tigers shot a male tiger who had rescued a little tiger cub. He brought it up with his dogs and it became a pet. He didn't learn his lesson because he was out hunting tigers again, and he was in danger of being mauled by a tiger when his little pet, who was called Salim, leapt at the big tiger's throat and managed to fend him off. Salim, the little tiger cub, died during the course of this, but was buried, according to the story, by his owner, who said that he cradled the dying tiger cub in his arms and he cried, and it's all terribly emotional. So this is an exceptional tomb, but normally, as I say, it's dogs and horses we've got a particularly nice tomb in Gwalior of Glancer, who was a spaniel who accompanied his master many, many expeditions, died in 1814 and was so loved that a long poem was written about him. And although it may sound silly, if you think about it, dogs in particular and horses were companions to Britons who were in very, very isolated circumstances, sometimes working entirely by themselves in dangerous conditions, and to have the emotional attachment to an animal was very, very important. And it may actually have kept them, not exactly sane, but kept them going. So I don't discount animal graves. I will always say something about animal graves when they're brought to my attention. Next, please. And here we are. This is something I've been doing for a long, long time. It's our journal, Chowkidar. Chowkidar, as you probably know, is the person who guards things, often guarding the street. The street is the chowk, so the Chowkidar is someone like a watchman who's sort of patrolling the streets. But also in cemeteries too, you'll find that most cemeteries will have a Chowkidar who may not always be in the cemetery, but if you stand by a cemetery gate and sort of rattle it and look as though you're fairly well off, you can be sure the Chowkidar will come running up a few minutes later and will let you in. And obviously you give the Chowkidar some money because they're not paid very much. So this is why we called it Chowkidar. And it's a blend of stories that are sent in, visits that people have made, a can you help section, people with queries, and book reviews. And we try and review books that wouldn't normally get much of a look in the tabloid press, for example, or the broadsheets. So there we are. Chowkidar does have illustrations too. And I think that's probably all I can say about it. It's been going since 1977. I've been the editor and I still enjoy doing it. And I think one thing I have noticed, certainly over the past decade, is that whereas before a lot of our stories about visiting cemeteries would come in from Britons going out to India and South Asia, we're now getting many, many more stories from people on the ground, local people. For example, in the last issue, we had a tremendously exciting find by a local man in Calcutta who'd found an inscription which we, Baxter, thought had been lost for many, many years. He was able to find it. We were able to do a bit of detective work and put together where it had been and how it got to where he found it. And this I find very encouraging. We really are very, very pleased when people from South Asia will contact us with stories, and we will publish them. I think that is the last slide. Yes, can you just, oh, I'm sorry, it isn't, I'm sorry. No, I wanted to say we're not all gloomy and dull. We do have exciting times. This was a dinner after one of our lectures, and our president, Sir Mark Havelock Allen, is standing up thanking the speaker. So we do have jolly times as well. We do have visits 2 or 3 times a year to places of Indian interest, Oriental interest, if you like. For example, earlier this year, we went to the Chelsea Physic Garden, and we were lucky enough to have an Indian botanist with us who took us around and showed us the section on Indian plants. We really enjoyed that. I think that's the end. Could you just go?
There's just one more.
Just one more.
Yeah.
That's our website. Good.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Llewellyn-Jones. And we do have a couple of minutes left. If there's any questions from the audience.
Let's have a look at the chat box.
Let's see. I don't see any questions in there, but did anybody have any questions at all? Otherwise, I have one, but someone else go first.
No sound. I have sound. Well, it looks as though most of it is about people who couldn't hear.
Oh, let's see. It looks like from Gina.
Okay.
Gina, it looks like you're on mute.
Any more questions?
let's see. Looks like we do have one from Gina. Let's see.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, there we go, Gina. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. I just have a quick question for Rosie. I found quite a few of my ancestors on the Baxter website and also on the in the Bengal obituary online. But you mentioned that there are files at the British Library and books of monumental inscriptions. I was wondering to what extent those are on the Baxter website, i.e. if I go to the British Library, am I likely to find people there that aren't on the website?
Yes, you will. We have not been able to digitize the contents of the cemetery files, and as I'm pretty sure that not all of the monumental inscription books have been digitized either. As I say, with the files, sometimes they're quite full of photographs and visitors' descriptions. In other cases, they're not. We simply don't know until we get there. I don't want to send you on a sort of false mission, but no, it's worth paying one visit perhaps. And also the British Library have the ecclesiastical returns, which are the lists of births, marriages and deaths. They're on microfilm. Some of them are digitized, find your ancestors, but not all of them. So again, it's probably worth going there for that.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
If it's anything specific, we can always do a bit of investigation. And of course, I'm always looking for stories for Chokadar. So if you've got a good story, I would like it.
Thank you, Gina. And it looks like we have time for one more question from Rosemary. If you would like to.
Thank you very much. Fantastic talk, really wide-ranging and wonderful to see the illustrations. And it may be a question that's really too big at this last few minutes, but you mentioned in one of the cemeteries that at one point it was a conservation area and then it wasn't. And I know that your talk has also covered rather a large number of different countries, but are the bulk of the cemeteries recorded in some way in terms of either being a conservation area or individual tombs being the equivalent of listed buildings in the UK? Because I have to say I'm completely blank in terms of the legislative framework in these countries.
Right, probably me as well. Some cemeteries are under the Archaeological Survey of India, the ASI. For example, a cemetery I know well in Lucknow in the residency is under the ASI, and they do a really good job of conservation. There's no doubt about it at all. With the Nicholson Cemetery that I showed you in Old Delhi, Intac they've certainly done a survey of all the names, but they probably need help in actual restoration. So it varies. Often it's down to the local cemetery committee. For example, in South Park Street Cemetery, I'm not aware that that's listed, though it certainly should be because it's spectacular. And at the moment, maintenance falls to the local cemetery committee with help from Baxter, obviously, and donations. It's a very mixed picture. In theory, anything which is under the ASI should be preserved and conserved, but many times you will go to an obscure little cemetery and find the ASI board outside, a blue enamel plaque, and complete desolation inside. India's a huge country. The subcontinent is even larger. Not everything can be preserved or looked after. So in theory, there's legislation, but in practice, it doesn't always work.
Mm-hmm. And then, Rosie, do you have time for just one more question? For a final question? Oh, can you hear me, Rosie?
Is that it?
Oh, there. So it looks like we might have one more question from Salome, if you'd like to go ahead. And then
yes, I'm sorry. Yes, I didn't realize. Go ahead.
Oh, that's all right.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Rosie, for the talk. It's actually a pretty nice coincidence. I just recently wrote to Buxa 2 days ago, and this talk came up. And I'm a resident from Surat, so I was really curious about the British cemetery in Surat, which is really unique. so I just received a reply today, and then Mr. Peter, he said that there are records on the cemetery itself, but there are no records of the people who are buried in that cemetery, which is what, as a writer, I wanted to know more about. Because there are so many interesting graves, which ranging from young women to soldiers to 2 months infants, and I'm not sure if someone like me who doesn't really have a British connection, but of course I'm a local, but I want to know the stories of these people. How should someone like me get started with it? I just wanted to know your inputs on this.
Yes. Well, I saw Peter. I saw our secretary's answer to you. Well, I think probably if the names of people in the Surat cemetery are not listed, then you start with listing them from the tombstones themselves. If the inscriptions are still clear, then that's the first thing. If you've got the names and the dates of death, then it's much easier to start looking at their history. So I would say that's the first thing. Photograph the inscriptions. And if you're able to do that, then we can probably help.
Yeah, actually, most of the epitaphs, they are pretty legible. So,
Yes.
And I do have the photographs. I can definitely send this to Baksa and see if we could pull off some connections. And
no,
yeah,
that would be a very good start indeed. We would appreciate that, and we can write stories about it. And in our Can You Help section, it's amazing how descendants will come forward and say, aha, my great-great-grandfather, I didn't know he was there. So yes, please send us what you've got. Be delighted.
Okay. And just one small thing that I wanted to add, Mr. Boone also added the major tombs that he mentioned was Ongier, Oxendens, and Woog's tomb, which is no longer there. Woog's tomb is no longer there, if I'm recalling it correctly. But there is one more tomb of Thomas Coriath, and I'm not sure if Baksa is aware of that. Who was the famous English writer who walked across India. And although that tomb is not named, but it is a little bit far from Surat, but it's a solitary tomb. And it is supposedly, it's thought that it would be of Thomas Coriath based on what we know from the text left behind by Edward Terry and other contemporaries.
You think this is Thomas Coriath's grave, do you?
Yeah. Me, along with other people who are better experts than me.
Okay, well, again, if you could send us a photograph, we'd be very pleased.
Yeah, sure. I'll do that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you again, Rosie, and to thank everybody that joined us today. So thank you very much. Well, we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to tell people about Baksa. Much appreciated. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.